When we think about European colonialism in Africa, it's often pictured as a sort of straightforward invasion, right?
Yeah, a direct takeover.
Exactly. But the early days of Italian involvement in Somalia, it paints a much more, well, nuanced picture.
How so?
Well, initially, the Italian commissioners arriving in the Somali sultanates, they were often seen more like diplomatic representatives, not really officials of a, dominant state.
More like ambassadors than rulers at first.
Right. It's almost counterintuitive. Okay, let's unpack this surprising start to Italian colonization in Somalia.
Yeah, what's fascinating here is how that initial seemingly diplomatic approach gradually shifted.
Definitely.
So today we're taking a deep dive into that formative period, drawing on some really insightful analyses. We've got excerpts from Africa during the Scramble, Poetry in the Desert, which gives a good backdrop, and, crucially, political and legal aspects of Italian colonialism in Somalia. And this one includes vital Somali scholarly perspectives.
Which is so important, right, to get beyond just the European viewpoint.
Absolutely essential.
And for you, our listener who wants to grasp complex topics, quickly but thoroughly, our mission today is to distill the essential insights, those genuine aha moments.
Right.
About Italy's early ambitions in Somalia, the strategies they used, the hurdles they faced, and maybe most importantly, those initial interactions with the Somali people.
Including resistance, the legal setups.
Exactly. We're aiming for that key knowledge without getting totally bogged down in detail.
So connecting this to the bigger picture,
Yeah.
we're really looking at the first steps, aren't we? How a colonial power starts to establish its presence.
Yeah, their goals, the justifications they cooked up, and how they dealt with the existing political scene in Somalia.
Okay, let's start there. Those early ambitions and legal justifications.
Right. A key figure here is Pasquale Stanislao Mancini. He was a big thinker on nationality.
I know the name.
Interestingly, his early ideas, presented way back at the University of Turin when it was capital of Sardinia, they were all about Italy's own right to unify.
Okay, so focusing inward first.
Exactly. But later, he sort of adapted that thinking to rationalize Italy's actions in Africa, called it a peaceful civilizing mission.
Wow, quite a leap.
Right.
From self-determination to justification for expansion.
It really is. So the key insight here, maybe for you, the listener, is seeing how an idea like a nation's right to exist can get twisted.
Twisted to justify taking over someone else's territory.
Precisely. That's a pattern you see again and again in colonial history, isn't it?
It really is. And it definitely reveals a common thread in colonial rhetoric.
Yeah.
Repurposing ideas like self-determination for expansionism.
Raises big questions about how national identity concepts get manipulated.
Are sure.
And those early attempts by Italy to actually get a foothold, well, let's just say they weren't instantly successful.
No smooth sailing initially.
Not really. They sent Chechi on a mission to Zanzibar. Kismayo was a big objective.
Kismayo. Important port.
Very. But the Sultan there, he already had strong ties with other Europeans, France, Britain, even Germany.
Established relationships.
Plus, France and Britain had already declared Zanzibar independent way back in 1862, which kind of complicated things for Italy.
So Italy was trying to enter a game that was already well underway. They couldn't just walk in.
Exactly. Their initial attempts to get a direct foothold were challenging.
Right.
So how did they then try to gain influence? Let's look at Kismayo again.
Yeah, it's interesting, that intricate web of European power dynamics already playing out. Zanzibar wasn't some blank slate.
Definitely not. And Kismayo remained the target. Italy was determined.
So they kept negotiating with the Sultan.
They did. And Filinardi, their guy, apparently took a pretty assertive stance.
Aggressive diplomacy, maybe?
You could say that. But things got complicated. The Imperial British East African Company, IBAC, got involved.
Ah, the chartered company. A big player for Britain in East Africa.
Right. And this whole transfer, it had to happen in 2 steps because Britain had a protectorate deal with Zanzibar.
Okay, so layers of agreements.
Yeah. First, the Sultan basically handed over authority in the Somali territories to IBAC.
Oh.
Then, IBAC made a deal with the Italians. It was all formalized in an Anglo-Italian protocol, March 1891.
So Britain acting as a sort of intermediary.
Pretty much, recognizing most of those Somali territories as Italy's sphere. But get this, the Oltriuba.
The area beyond the Juba River.
Yeah, including Kismayo, the place Italy really wanted, that wasn't actually transferred until 1924.
Wow, decades later. So a really protracted process.
It was, and what's striking here, I think, is how Italy, despite its ambitions, really had to navigate these existing power dynamics. They couldn't just do whatever they wanted.
That really speaks volumes about the realities of the scramble for Africa, doesn't it?
It does. It shows the constraints on Italy's power initially. They had to negotiate work within the existing European framework.
And the delay with Altrigiba shows their goals weren't always met quickly.
Okay, so they've carved out their sphere. Let's talk about how they actually set up protectorates and their first administrative structures.
Right, the next step.
They secured protectorates over Hobyo and the Majeerteen Sultanates, started in 1889 with Sultan Kennedy of Hobyo. And here's the thing, the Italian government initially wanted these to be cost-free.
Cost-free, seriously?
Yeah, they were hoping commercial ventures would just blossom without needing troops or much government spending.
Wow. Talk about optimistic. That really says something about Italy's limited resources, maybe. Or underestimating the job.
Probably both. A real tension between ambition and capability.
And that hope for a low-cost venture. I'm guessing it didn't quite pan out.
Not exactly, especially when you look at how they tried to administer the Benadir coast.
Okay, Benadir. So places like Brawa, Merka, Mogadishu.
Warshake, too. Initially, administration there was handed over to a private company, the Filinardi Company, from 1893 to 96.
Ah, the company model again.
Yes, and it was through a deal with the Sultan of Zanzibar. And remarkably, the Sultan's flag kept flying over those towns.
Still the Sultan's flag.
Yeah.
Interesting. Shows limited Italian control at that point.
It does. The agreement did ban the slave trade, which is notable.
Though enforcement is always the question there.
True. And they even set up separate legal systems, Sharia law with Qadi's Islamic judges for locals, and Italian law for Europeans.
That dual system. A classic feature of colonial rule, isn't it?
It really is. Imposing your own authority, but selectively keeping local systems. But always with your law on top. That's a critical takeaway for you, the listener.
Yeah, it suggests maybe some respect for existing structures, but Italian influence is definitely growing underneath.
But the Filinardi Company didn't last long. By 1896, the Italian government took over directly.
Why they change?
Well, apparently the government wouldn't give Filinardi the money he asked for defense, so the contract was terminated.
Ah, so the private company model proved unsustainable. The costs and complexities were too much.
Seems like it. That transfer to direct state control is a really crucial turning point.
A shift towards more direct rule.
Right. Now, this wasn't all peaceful administration. There was resistance, some significant early conflicts.
Okay, let's hear about that.
Take Bottega's expedition, 1895 to 97. It was presented as scientific.
But probably wasn't just about science.
Not entirely. It had a strong military side. They had Ascari's local soldiers, but armed by Italians and firearms. And their interactions weren't always friendly. They clashed with locals, even set up a military fort, a station they called it, in Lukuk.
So exploration mixed with force, that underscores the violence often hidden under the surface of these scientific missions.
Definitely. Setting up a fort marks a more assertive phase, moving beyond just diplomacy or trade.
Towards direct control, yeah.
And the Benadir Company, they took over after the state for a bit, 1900 to 1905. They also had big problems.
Like what?
Limited money, not much real control outside the main towns. And there's this disturbing account. They used corporal punishment. 50 lashes.
50 lashes?
For what? For Somalis found with weapons in Merka.
Oof. That's brutal.
It is, and it's noted that some locals actually felt the Sharia courts were more just than the Italian system.
Wow. That says a lot, doesn't it? Yeah. If the traditional courts seem fairer than the colonial ones.
It's a pretty damning comparison. Highlights issues of legitimacy, how imposed systems can be seen as deeply unjust.
Absolutely.
Then you get the Bimal tribes uprising, 1904, 1905. They actually besieged Merka.
A major revolt then. What were the reasons?
Pretty clear, apparently. The slavery issue hadn't gone away, and people were fed up with the ineffective administration.
So fundamental local grievances weren't being addressed.
Exactly. It took reinforced Ascaris to put down the revolt, and sadly, many locals died.
A stark example of resistance against colonial rule and its failures.
And this period also sees the rise of a really major figure, Mohammed Abdullah Hassan.
Ah, the mullah.
Often called the mullah, yes.
Yeah.
But he was much more than just a religious leader. He was incredibly skilled, persistent, a real leader of resistance.
And seen by many now as a precursor to Somali nationalism.
Exactly. His rise is pivotal, a powerful, organized challenge to both Italian and British ambitions in the region.
Recognizing him that way, as a proto-nationalist, gives a crucial Somali perspective.
It does. And then, in a surprising twist, 1905, there's an agreement. The Illig Treaty.
An agreement between Italy and the mullah.
Yes. Italy recognized his leadership in the Nugal Valley under Italian protection, believe it or not.
Under Italian protection. That sounds contradictory.
It does. They granted religious freedom, trade rights, but no arms or slaves trade. And they put limits on where his Dervish followers could be.
So a pragmatic deal? Or did people see it as Italy being weak, having to negotiate with him?
Good question. It's complex. It might have seemed like a concession, but maybe Italy thought it could contain his influence this way.
Keep him in one area, avoid more conflict.
Possibly, but Prenetti, an Italian politician, had reservations, worried it might actually help the mullah consolidate power later.
Yeah, a risky strategy, perhaps. Giving recognition might backfire.
Definitely a gamble. Now let's circle back to the legal side of things. We touched on it, but it's fascinating.
The different systems coexisting.
Right. You had customary Somali law, Sears Islamic law, Sharia, and Italian colonial law, all operating at the same time.
And Sear was pretty important for clan life, dispute resolution.
Absolutely. It shows the sophisticated legal traditions already in place. It wasn't some lawless land. The elders played a key role.
Underscoring that decentralized Somali social structure.
And Italy's general approach, well, they allowed customary law for the locals.
But Italian law was always supreme.
Always. Especially if Europeans were involved or it was about public order.
So that led to the dual system we mentioned. Italian courts for Europeans, Islamic courts, qadis for Somalis.
Exactly. Especially for things like family matters, inheritance, personal status.
And those systems stayed separate for a long time.
Pretty much until after independence, 1956, when they were finally integrated.
Interesting. Okay, what about the economy? How did that develop?
Well, things took a big turn there. Italy wanted a self-sufficient colony.
Right, make it pay for itself.
And they saw the territory as underpopulated. So they shifted from using existing slave labor towards forced labor.
Ah, forced labor. The objective stays the same, exploitation, but the method changes slightly.
Exactly. It became a primary way to exploit the fertile lands.
Adapting to changing international norms, maybe? At least on paper?
Perhaps. But this forced labor, it wasn't voluntary. It was coercion, threats, intimidation.
Distinct from legitimate work like military service or prison sentences.
Very distinct. And Italian agricultural businesses like the big Gianale farming settlement relied heavily on it. And get this, land concessions often didn't even go to experienced farmers.
No. Who got them then?
Often individuals with political connections back in Italy.
Wow. So patronage over expertise. That really shows the exploitative nature of it all, driven by self-interest, not real development.
Absolutely. Now, even with those early protectorates over the sultanates, there was still resistance when Italy decided to fully take over.
This was later on.
1925. They finally moved to occupy Hobyo and Majertine fully. Sultan Ali Yusuf of Hobyo was arrested.
So they're fighting.
Some initial resistance led by his lieutenants, but it was fairly short-lived ultimately.
Okay.
And by 1908, even before that final occupation, the fascist administration had already revoked those initial protection agreements.
Right, tearing up the old deals.
And formally proclaimed the colony of Somalia. They wanted more stability, needed to deal with unrest, the Dervish in the north, the Bimal revolt in the south.
So a consolidation of power, moving fully to direct rule, suppressing resistance.
That seems to be the goal. And finally, one last point. The border with Ethiopia.
Yes. Always a contentious issue in the Horn of Africa.
It was never clearly defined between Italian Somalia and Ethiopia. This led to a lot of friction, political and military.
Any specific incidents?
Yes, a serious one at Bahali in 1907. Italian askaris and officers were killed clashing with Ethiopian forces.
A deadly border clash.
Yet, Italy didn't seem in any rush to actually settle the border formally.
Maybe an undefined border served their strategic interests somehow, kept options open.
Could be. It certainly highlights the problems caused by these often arbitrary colonial boundaries, problems that lasted long after the colonial era.
Absolutely.
So to wrap up this initial phase, it was really complex, wasn't it?
Definitely not straightforward.
You had ambitions that weren't always met, lots of diplomatic maneuvering, some very questionable legal justifications.
Significant local resistance.
Yeah.
And the start of an exploitative economic system using forced labor.
Understanding these foundational dynamics, these early stages, is just so essential for grasping what came next in Somalia's history.
Yeah, I think the aha moment for me looking back at this is just how constrained Italy's power actually was at the start.
Right, not the immediate dominance, you might assume.
Exactly. They had to work within existing structures. They faced constant resistance. Their admin and legal systems weren't always effective or seen as fair. It wasn't that swift, unchallenged takeover.
And you can really draw a line, can't you, from these early legal setups, the social impacts, the resistance, the economic policies.
To later developments, the road to independence, the challenges of the post-colonial state.
It all has roots back here.
Which leads to a provocative thought, maybe for you, the listener, to ponder.
Go on.
Considering those coexisting legal systems, Seer, Sharia, Italian law, and those early strong resistance movements, how might these initial encounters have fundamentally shaped the long-term Italy-Somalia relationship?
And maybe the whole trajectory of Somali history itself.
Exactly. What might have been different?
That's a profound question to sit with. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the early chapters of Italian colonialism in Somalia.
It really shows the layers, doesn't
Yeah.
it? Beneath the surface of history.
It certainly does. Thanks for listening.